Hello, Warhammer fans. Today we take a step into the unknown with the Necron Raider. First released in January 1998 in White Dwarf 217. The Necron Raiders were, I think, in my memory at least, the only time Games Workshop ever completely released a completely new race. Well, not unless you count Space Crusade, but that's a long time back. And it's been a long time since Games Workshop released something completely new, completely different, to frankly very little warning. And I thought that was one of the seminal moments of my young uh, Games Workshop career. At the time, in 1998, I was, I was 17, and seeing this thing for the first time, strapped to the front of an issue of White Dwarf, made me buy it immediately, because it was just such a unique thing to basically see come to life, and it was just really really exciting at the time. I remember the appearance of these miniatures on White Dwarf magazine meant that people were going around buying up all spare copies that they could find, or else they would beg, borrow, or steal as many Necron warriors as they could physically get their hands on, and it was pretty exciting to be in the hobby at the time. So what happens was, in that White Dwarf, they released basic rules for just two units that will be available to the Necron armies at the time, and that was essentially the Scarabs, which had a really interesting rule. They could clamp onto vehicles and reduce its armor value, because the idea was that they would sort of strip away, or I'm not sure whether they stripped away the layers of defenses of vehicles, or else they just in some other way just disrupted a vehicle. Because what would happen is that when the Necron lifted off, when the Scarab lifted off, essentially the armor value of the vehicle would remain. So it could be that they had some kind of a disruptive field that sort of knocked down the armor value of the target that it clamped on its way to. I mean, of course, this is just a gameplay mechanic, right? But it was a rather cool one because it kind of allowed Necron warriors to have a chance at destroying even the toughest of vehicles, and that meant that they at least had a strategy for holding their own on the battlefield. And at the time, since they only had just warriors, Necron warriors with their, really effective and powerful Flay, Gauss Flayer gun, as well as the Scarabs, that was kind of enough for them to make a dent in a lot of armies. Not to mention, of course, the fact that they had the Will Be Back rule, which could sort of bring them back. But essentially, facing a Necron army on the field, or at least a Necron raiding force, they weren't quite an army at this point. They were just Necron Raiders at the time. You really had a tough choice between deciding between blasting the Scarabs that were sort of compromising the armor of your heavier units, or else focusing on the warriors themselves. Well, the warriors themselves were, I mean, they had the ability to get back up after they took enough damage to knock them off their feet, right? So, and they had Space Marine stats, so they weren't really anything to sneeze at in that sense. So there was always this need to get rid of these guys, but there was also the need to get rid of the annoying Scarabs. They would just sort of go around attaching themselves to vehicles and compromising their defenses and so on. So it was a rudimentary strategy, but at least they had an answer to armor, and the warriors themselves were relatively tough, so they could weather just about anything, and that sort of made them this interesting and very unique take on the on games of basically second edition at the time. So yeah, Necrons, very very cool stuff. At this point, of course, there was no codex to speak of. In fact, it wouldn't be until much later on that they got essentially their heavy units in the form of destroyers, which were terrifying, as well as having like their first HQ unit, which was just the regular Necron Lord with his amazing like evil undead Pope hat. So yeah, Necrons, quite the thing. At the time, I think they were just awakening in the lore. They weren't quite an established army at the time. In basically they had fairly rudimentary rules and not a lot of options available to them. So most of the stories or battle reports featuring the Necrons usually tended to be very, very small because you could maybe scrape together a couple of squads of these guys at best. At least around the time that the White Dwarf was released, because it took a while for the actual like regular raiders to be available in the box set anyway. So at the time, a lot of people just sort of amassed as many of these squads as you could get. And if, for example, you had a guy in your gaming group commit to collecting Necrons, he could look to maybe put together, I don't know, 10, 5 if he was lucky, of these guys together with as many scarabs as he could muster. But very cool unit because they are very, very cool in concept because it was something new and different. And conceptually, the idea, I guess, of an army that was sort of unknown and kind of implacable and sort of all but immune to your strongest weapons was just really a really exciting concept. The fact that they got back up again was, I mean, it's an annoying rule, right? Because it invalidates a lot of your best strategies at dealing with these guys. But it's that way for a reason. And I think it sort of trod that really exciting line. I know the guys in my gaming group at the time, um, we were all in school and stuff. So, but we found these things like absolutely terrifying, and just the effect they would have, even a small number of these guys on the battlefield, would be really exciting to play out. And coupled with the idea that they had a bit of a sort of mysterious storyline, the whole premise was that the Necrons were just awakening at the time and they were appearing on isolated worlds in small numbers, usually entering like Imperial facilities or messing around with Imperial explorators on the fringes of the galaxy to pick up small amounts of like specific kinds of biomaterial, or else disappearing explorator outposts on the fringes of the galaxy, was just very compelling stuff for my friends and I at the time, and we really had a ball playing against the Necrons and piloting the Necrons ourselves, of course, which was the thing at the time. So, in my opinion, this was the most exciting way you could potentially launch an army, and we enjoyed it greatly. So, anyway, back to the miniature at hand. I've jumped in and blocked in a lot of these areas with Black Templar. You didn't see this because it happened off camera, but I almost had a bit of a mental breakdown earlier trying to figure out what colors to paint a Necron, because and there is a really good reason for this, right? Because I feel Necrons are one of those factions that really could look good in almost any color scheme. At the time, the official White Dwarf pictures, and later the pictures on the box art for the Necron Raiders box sets, all showed Necrons kind of in various levels of metal or different shades of metal. And at the time, it's easy to kind of understate how significant this was, because that niche for a metallic army wasn't really in the game at the time. There are plenty of factions in Warhammer Fantasy, for example, where using metallic colors was a big thing. So, for example, High Elves, essentially, if you were to look at the miniatures of the day, the main color that you would see on the figures, because of all that scale mail and bright silver helmets, was essentially silver. And that sort of was part of their faction identity. It made high elf armies always look clean and polished and impressive to look at, shiny, and in all their ranks and all their glory. And to be fair, there wasn't really anything that was the equivalent of this in 40k. Not unless you were, say, collecting Silver Skull Space Marines or one of those, really. But there was no official metallic colored army in the lore. And I remember this being quite interesting for my gaming group, because metal paints at the time were kind of seen as just something that you would use to add detail to like things like weapons and other working surfaces, right? You wouldn't actually use this to paint the bulk of your miniature unless you were collecting high elves. So that was fairly unique. And it kind of put us in the mind of experimenting with different shades of metallics, which was something that was quite seminal for my friends and I, because that was just something that we hadn't come to grips with. There was no other faction that featured metallic paints in such large amounts, and that was just really something exciting for us to experiment with. Kind of opened our eyes to all the different other kinds of colors. I mean, at that time, I think the only miniature that was obviously painted in metallic colors and was in regular circulation in White Dwarf and just in people's collections was the Dark Angels Captain, who was painted in metallic green, and that already was a fairly unique thing. But it was clearly not a standard color scheme for a miniature, and that kind of made it unique and interesting, but just not common to see. Cool. I'm going to drop a little bit of a hairdryer session on this because there's just so much Black Templar on the miniature that I need to come back in a sec. So yeah, cheers. We are back. So yeah, you might be wondering why I had a mini meltdown when it comes to selecting colors for this miniature. I guess the simplest way of explaining it is I am just kind of confused by all of the surfaces on this miniature. I mean, look, I know it's just a Necron. I know Necrons have all these like worky bits on the surface that kind of look like they're important, like all these little pistons and rivets and bolts and so on. I think my challenge with picking a color scheme for this model is I inherently want to paint everything a different color. And I think Necrons, and you can fight me on this, Necrons look best in a limited palette. And I think like even the best looking Necrons that you can kind of find on the internet keep to a fairly constrained palette. And my challenge is when I see all these wires and gubbins and like my mind immediately goes, how do I work out how this thing is built, right? So on some level, because this thing was sculpted by a human, right? Clearly, somebody started with a basic form and then sequentially added layers and layers and layers of detail until they reach this final stage. And my issue, I suppose, is the idea that I feel like every single layer that's added needs to be its own color, because kind of like the way your Gauss flare guns would strip away things in layers, these miniatures were built in layers, and therefore I feel compelled to paint everything a different color. Every single layer needs to have its own color, right? But that doesn't work with the sort of limited palette approach. If you paint everything a different color, you're going to end up with a model that's just insanely complex to look at, and you're going to lose the essential silhouette of the miniature, and that's no good, right? I guess the mental exercise for me then is to realize that, or how I eventually got myself to start painting this model instead of just staring at it in despair, is to realize that, frankly, there are only two things that you need to understand about this miniature. You need to understand that there is a robot, like front and center, right? It's a robot. You need to understand that it's a robot. So with that in mind, you don't choose something too colorful, because robots are, well, robots that have lain in the earth for untold millennia, I suppose, as is their backstory. Those just need to be, they just need to look kind of ancient and of one material, right? I don't need to pick out every single rivet. I don't need to pick out every single worky bit. I don't need to pick out every single gasket and seal and bolt and rivet and that kind of thing. And then the only other thing that I need to pay attention to actually is just this gun, because that's the business end of the Necron, right? That's the part that hurts. So I need to make sure that this gun is as impressive looking as I can. And with that in mind, it makes sense to concentrate the most exciting colors on that part of the model. And in addition, you need to know that he's got a face, and the face is really what you look at when you look at an unfamiliar silhouette, right? You look for a face on a thing. And he's got this weird hunchy kind of posture that complicates the way the face looks a little bit, because it needs to where the head should be, which is above its shoulders, where it should be on a normal human. It's kind of not there. It's kind of below a little bit, right? In between his shoulder blades, between these two giant shoulder pads. So my challenge then is to make sure that you can easily pick out the head of the miniature. So I need to paint the head in a way that's visibly different from everything else. Because of the way they've got these giant shoulder pads, it's just a GW thing, I suppose. As with all the Space Marines and so on, I had an initial temptation to do the shoulder pads in different colors, but that's of course a mistake, right? Because that will complicate the position of the head, and visually that would not get the right effect, because the shoulder pad, I suppose, will kind of hide the position of the head. So I had to do the head. I had to basically step back from the idea of adding too many colors onto the shoulder pads and just focus on what's really important, which is his head. In addition, the thing that kills me a little bit, like I said earlier, is all these wires. I don't really know what to do with them, but I do know that the wires which are connected to the gun are more important to the overall look of the miniature than anything else. So I need to remember that the gun is the important bit. So with that in mind, I think the cables I will do in 2 shades of green. I think Necrons look good in 2 shades of green, and technically there's a bit of cheating because then it's still just one green, right? There's only one color, which is green. So I'm going to use Mantis Warriors Green for the funky eyes, which kind of look good with almost a bit of an OSL kind of bleed. So we can go ahead and apply Mantis Warriors Green quite indiscriminately over the surface around the eye sockets, and that will look good, right? Because it's kind of that perfect Gauss sort of green. And then I've got Aeldari Emerald, which I think I can use to apply to the cables that I don't want to attract too much attention to. So cool, I'm gonna dry this guy off again because this guy has a lot of like complexity to him and there's a lot of black drying. So back in a bit. So now the model is nice and dry. I can come in with Mantis Warriors Green to decide which of the cables I want to pick out in which color. So of the cable designs on the back, I find that they are the ones which are nice and ribbed, and those are kind of more interesting looking and they do connect directly to the gun. So maybe those are the ones that I pick up, right? Because they've got an interesting texture and visually there is this kind of like dangerous worky bit kind of look to them. They look like they've got an important job, these cables. And I am not an engineer, so but these ribbed sort of cables remind me of the ones that connect to really big and complex pieces of equipment. So it makes sense to do that in the brightest color. Plus they look nice. They've got a sense of direction to them because they do have these vertical lines that kind of help you visualize distance. Okay, the ribbing. And then you've got the tip of his gun, which I'm going to just smear off ever so slightly with my finger because I want that fade. So the tip of the gun already looks more dangerous than everything else. And then you've got these vertical, I guess, this vertical chamber inside the Gauss blaster. Or Gauss flare, rather. And so much of why Necrons were cool was because of this gun, right? This gun isn't just a gun. It's essentially a teleportation device. What it does is that it moves matter through the gun and teleports it back to their home world. So one of the things I really liked about the way Games Workshop built out this faction is that they had to basically give it a technology base that was essentially different from everybody else. At some point, if your technology is high enough, if you're high tech enough, it's essentially space magic bullshit, right? And that's kind of what I think Games Workshop wanted to do with this miniature. So, or this faction, I suppose. So space magic bullshit means that these guys use teleportation, which is already an incredibly complex concept in the 40k universe. Because when you think about it, who else teleports? Essentially the elites of the Space Marines. And if you assume that Space Marines are at a tech level above and beyond any Imperial Guardsmen of the time, beyond the ken of Guardsmen, and let's remember that Guardsmen, the entire Imperial Guard faction, does not use teleportation devices of any kind, then you kind of begin to see how they've built up this idea of the Necron tech level. And I really think that's quite clever, right? So, Terminators of this time, they teleport down to the surface when needed. They were also incredibly dangerous because they had a tendency to malfunction and potentially kill your precious Terminators. So that was a rule that was a very big part of 40k. And then you could, of course, use teleport homers to try to increase the accuracy. But even then, it merely improved the situation. It didn't fix the problem entirely. So yeah, clearly teleportation is only something that the most high-tech races get to use. And of course, this is where you see that the Necrons have this technology, this rare technology, on their basic grunts, on their basic gun, doing a very basic job, succeeding in the teleportation every single time. And you see this in two areas, of course. You've got the Gauss Blaster, which teleports materials back to their ship. I'm calling it a blaster. It's really a flayer, isn't it? So the Gauss Flayer teleports materials back to their ships, Gauss weapons in general, I suppose. And then you've got the phase out rule, which would teleport the remains of Necron warriors who have been defeated back to their ship, or else when the force or the expedition basically felt like it wasn't achieving enough headway, they would teleport en masse off the battlefield. And so just the prevalence of teleportation technology in something as mundane as guns, as well as just a basic mechanic that every Necron, regardless of level or abilities at the time, could use readily, that's amazing. That really brought out the idea that these guys were on a level never before seen. I've moved on to the Aeldari Emerald, as you can see, and it's quite a lot bluer, and I really like this play of like, if you're going to use green, you might as well use two very different shades of green, right? Something that's more in the blue spectrum, as is the case with Aeldari Emerald. It's still visibly green. Like, if you saw this color in isolation, you would 100% call it green. But because it's placed next to Mantis Warriors Green, you get this wonderful kind of hot-cold kind of dynamic, and I really like the way that looks. And then, yeah, so where was I? Yeah, so teleportation technology is just everywhere in this faction, and that coupled with the fact that it was that the universe or basically the 40k setting tells you in many places that teleportation technology is bordering on the arcane, and that really set off the whole idea that the Necrons were in a different league, and that felt really good because it's the qualities of the bad guys, the quality of the bad guys that makes a setting, guys. Nobody cares how much, well, of a good setting, in my opinion, or of a clever or well thought out setting. It's the quality of the bad guys that makes the setting feel so much more interesting, because it's the ennobled sacrifice, or it's the sacrifice essentially of heroes against impossible odds that makes it ennobles the sacrifice, as it is the deed of trying to defend those weaker than yourself. And with the Necrons, they were so overwhelmingly far ahead technologically that you kind of felt that whoever was facing them was kind of again really up against it. And I think that kind of narrative worked really well in my mind. So I'm dropping a bit of Nuln Oil onto the green, onto the silver bits now, just to give them a little bit of definition. And this is okay because I will probably pick out some of these areas in another wash in order to stain them maybe more yellowish or more brownish or something. But starting with just a neutral black wash, Nuln Oil, to me sounds like a good start, because anything that you add over this is going to darken further anyway. And Necrons kind of should be kind of dark and mysterious looking, right? So that kind of works for me, I suppose, color scheme wise. So yeah, He's looking better than I thought he would already, simply because I made the decision, I suppose, to be selective about which areas of the model to pick out, and I had to fight my own instincts to get here. So I am kind of chuffed actually because he's looking real good. And it's this ability, I suppose, for Necrons to look really good with even basic paint jobs, with just a handful of colors, which really sort of led to them being the popular faction that they are today. Now, in my opinion, there are way too many different kinds of Necrons now. And I did collect an army of Necrons during third edition, and they were okay, I suppose. I think I was happy at the point when you had things like wraiths and flayed ones and so on and so forth. I was a little bit less excited when there were many new Canoptech this and Triarch Stalker that. Ironically, it was just having too many units which do fairly similar things that kind of made it a lot less compelling for me personally. So case in point, I think one of the units that I really did not like were the Lich Guard, because I thought Lich Guard, frankly, was a very human solution to a very Necron problem. The idea that you had elites walking around and they were equipped and armed better than everybody else, and they were sort of lording it over the basic Necrons essentially. Didn't really care for it. When you have a faction that's kind of united in purpose, it makes sense that you equip everybody the same way, because the idea then is that they all have equal chance of performing well in whatever role that they are in, right? So that's machine logic to me. That sounded like a Necron, and I really liked the idea at the time. You could have fast response units in the form of destroyers. That made perfect sense because you sometimes had to be somewhere quick, but for the most part, you didn't need everything to be moving quickly. And then you've got the Scarabs, which were just a wonderful solution to a lot of problems. I do understand that, yes, they do need to sell miniatures, but from a faction perspective, I really liked the idea that the Necrons were so simple, yet they had a clearly defined set of roles, and they were just really effective at what they were doing without adding half a dozen different units that all kind of do the same thing. But yes, I understand that they do need to sell miniatures, so there. So what I'm doing now is I'm grabbing a bit of Vallejo Silver Grey, and I'm adding this to a bit of Black Templar to create a slightly bluish highlight. And I'm just thinking about where I want to apply this now, because there are so many surfaces that could benefit from just a little bit of pop. But I'm going to be fairly conservative about how I apply this, because I don't want the model to look too grey. So yeah, so the other thing that gets me a little bit about these miniatures is that in terms of surfaces, they're kind of familiar but not familiar, right? Like even the way the hands are organized, I kind of don't really know how to highlight that. It's similar to the way I do like the back of human hands, but it's a little bit more textured. So I guess it's kind of forcing my hand a little bit. Yeah. I realize now I'm spending my time highlighting the hydraulics, which might have looked good in another color, but no, let's not go down that route. Let's just keep it simple and paint this Necron the way I believe he was intended, to just be fairly straightforward. Just a death robot on his way to melt a few fools. Don't need to really overdo things. Shoulder pad wise, just maybe a gentle line here down the side, which I can then come in and clean up a little bit later on if it's a little bit too gaudy and big. But I think this looks just fine. Yeah, so I mean, I liked the way Necrons were launched. I liked it enough to collect a third edition army. And for me, I really liked the idea that you had a dichotomy between lords and warriors. So lords were the more sentient, more interesting characters that had a bit of individuality to it. They had a bit of a Bond villain kind of thing with them, which I really enjoyed. Just the idea that they would use ridiculously overcomplicated means to achieve fairly simple things. So, for example, I remember Night Fight being a rule. Necrons had an item that, a sort of piece of war gear, I guess, that could turn off night fighting. And their solution, I kid you not, whereas sort of like a modern race, or a relatively high tech, well provisioned kind of army of humans would just fire flares into the sky, for example, to illuminate the battlefield. No, 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 no. The Necrons, what they would do is they would use their arcane ability to move astral bodies about to essentially create a solar flare, and that solar flare would illuminate the entire planet to their satisfaction. That was how the Necrons did things. It was just so ridiculously bombastic and over the top, and I kind of really like that kind of idea. The idea that your average Necron is just a grunt doing his thing, and they are just a giant phalanx of warriors walking around. But then when you got to the characters, they were really insanely like powerful, and they had incomprehensible technologies. They had something called a chronometron, and the whole point of the chronometron was to disrupt enemy charges. Now, regular units, of course, would simply use grenades, right? Grenades would cause assaulting units to hunker down and keep their heads down, so it might disrupt their charge. But no, 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 the Necrons didn't do such a simple task that way. What they did was they had a chronometron, which was an item that could literally slow down time. Right? Right? They had an item that could literally slow down time in order to make the enemy charge fail. And that's insane, and that's insanely cool as well. And it's so extra that it was just fantastic to see. And what else did they have? They had crazy stuff. They had basically to give themselves a ward save, I think, or to basically make them tougher to kill. They had something called a phylactery, and everybody who is a Harry Potter fan, I suppose, or those of you who read those books, would know what a phylactery is, because that's a Horcrux, isn't it? So essentially, in order to sort of, instead of just having a personal force field or something to just keep you alive from the enemy guns, they had literally a soul jar to inter the Lord's consciousness, so that were he to be taken out, he could resurrect and teleport back into the fray. Because that's just how the Necrons operated. They were so extra. They had worked out everything about time and space and spatial positioning, that the idea that the Necron Lord, and what's meaningful to a Necron once you worked out time and space, right? Because if a Necron Lord were to go down in combat, what he would do is just go, okay, cool, I have backed up my consciousness into a phylactery at home. I can teleport back there, get it fixed, get myself fixed, maybe take a short holiday, maybe have a strong drink, and then teleport back in, and my enemies would still be in that position trying to kill me. It's amazing. So just the idea that the Necrons were so extra with their technology was just really, really fun as a concept, and I dearly love that sort of thing. It was just so silly, right? A solar flare basically to stop night fight. To light up a room, you change the sun. Got it. Got it. And that's just the best for me. So yeah, Necrons were great. I really like that. But when there was the reboot essentially that made Necrons a lot more sentient and a lot more controlling over the Catan. It's okay. It's all right. Like I get that in order to personalize the army for you to feel like you had a unique force from your mates, you had to give people the ability to kind of customize and personalize your force. You could always do that, in my opinion, though, because I think in the days of Necron Raider armies or forces, what you would do is you would name your Raider force after the place where they were discovered. And this is something that there was already a precedent for, right? For example, this is why the entire Tyranid race was called the Tyranids, because they were discovered on the planet Tyran. So I guess they should be Tyranids as opposed to Tyranids. I don't know, but yeah. So this idea of naming things from the AdMech perspective, or from the explorator, the imperial climatologist kind of perspective, planetologist kind of perspective, was already present in the game, and it was kind of cool to call them that. But and then of course you could just personalize the color schemes based on that. You didn't really need to invent dynasties of Necron warriors and essentially turn them to space tomb kings. I felt it wasn't necessary. I kind of liked the way the Necrons were in the past, because they were just unknown enough to be interesting and for you to really invent your own stories. We didn't really need to be for it to be on rails, in my opinion, which is why the Necrons to this day, and I don't regret this at all, are the only the only army that I've ever collected properly, like fully painted and everything, which I sold off because I just wasn't compelled by their storyline beyond a certain point. And yeah, don't feel bad about it even. But yeah, Necron Raiders. At this time, the excitement was palpable. Just the idea that this symbolized a new kind of threat, something that had never been seen before except in movies. You know the ones. Because this is the age of Arnie, right? This is the age of the action movie. And everybody loved those movies to death anyway. So Terminator was a thing. And these guys looked definitely like Terminator. In particular, they sort of emulated that final scene in the first Terminator movie, where Sarah Connor gets chased by this cyborg assassin, or android assassin, I suppose. I don't think there is enough of an equality between the organic and inorganic parts to call this an android. So it was a cybernetic organism, right? Even the film called it that. Yeah. Anyway, so just the idea that this robot assassin was sent to go after Sarah Connor, tracked her down to this factory, and that final scene where it kind of lurches after her, even having been bisected by industrial machinery, chasing her to the very end, was just awesome stuff, right? And that's basically what they did with the Terminator themed parts of this army, where basically they had the rule that they could sort of phase out, or they could sort of just never be killed fully. Was just really, really good stuff for the time, and I loved it. It was good fun. It was original, and it was kind of cool. And I think from a collection point of view, I think it was kind of nice that you could basically have free reign to paint this in as complicated way as you want. Although, like I'm saying here, I think Necrons look kind of best with a simple color scheme. Like you want to really keep them fairly desaturated, in my opinion, and then pick one color to really emphasize the important bits of the miniature, i.e. the gun, as well as whatever cabling that he had that was connected in some way to the gun. And with as compelling a method of killing people as teleporting them like billions of miles away into another galaxy, essentially, how could you not focus on the gun, right? That was literally the most compelling thing about Necrons as a whole, quite apart from the fact that they phase out back to their home world. If everything goes wrong, they always have an exit plan, and that's the Bond villain. That's the bullshit pseudoscience part that really compelled me about early Necrons. So yeah, so keeping the color scheme fairly simple, fairly uncomplicated, has really made it a lot easier for me to appreciate painting this miniature. And there's a useful lesson for everyone there, right? Well, and for myself, of course, chiefly because I went through the process and the brain melt. I realized that I don't need to overthink color schemes, that, sticking to the original clever like color schemes that emphasize the bits that mattered most are kind of important. If you've got miniatures that essentially hold the gun in two hands, then it makes sense to emphasize the gun because that's the business end of the miniature. This is a challenge that you sometimes get with miniatures that have too much going on, really, in terms of their equipment. So if you've got a model that holds a weapon in either hand, and they're both different, which is the case with a lot of Space Marine assault troops, for example, then you need to sort of lean into that and choose which weapon you want to emphasize. So do your power weapon in as bright and as glorious a color scheme as you want, but you keep the bolt pistol fairly subdued, and then your eye always knows which direction to look at, while still realizing that there's a very dangerous gun. Essentially, you make it so that like the arms are interesting for different reasons, right? Because our brains, I think, understand that guns are dangerous. They see the shape, the barrel, the sort of snub pistol nose for the muzzle, and we know that's the business end of a very dangerous thing. But then you've got the power sword that's kind of crackling and exciting, or the power fist that looks like a wrecking ball, and that really draws our attention. So much of painting is about this sleight of hand, about understanding where the viewer's attention goes, and basically being very careful about not saturating the viewer's mind with too much complexity, such that the attention gets split up. And Necrons are perfect for illustrating this principle. And painting this miniature has brought out this lesson in me, and I am pleased. Go Necron Raiders. You really were the best version of Necrons, in my opinion. Well, except for the bits with the solar flare, because that shit is bonkers. It's just the best. Yeah. So I never really had an army of Necron Raiders. Sorry. So what I did was I gave them to a friend of mine because he started collecting them, and I guess for me the metallic color scheme didn't appeal as much. I had pretty bitter experiences trying to paint high elves. All that silver which wouldn't shade nicely, and you got to remember that this is the period before Nuln Oil, right? So if you wanted to shade lots of high elves, you needed to kind of essentially mix your own color, and the quality of stuff, or just the resources, really, not just the quality, just the lack of know-how with understanding how I wanted to sort of mix things in order to get a consistent shade across all that metal. I guess it just wasn't something I wanted to deal with. So in the end, I ended up giving my Necrons to somebody else who put together an army, and to his credit, used them to fry our circuits with how overpowered and how amazing these Necrons were. And we had, as a result, some of the best gaming we'd ever had. And it was great fun, wonderful times. And I don't know, maybe one day Games Workshop will do something like this again, like reveal something strange and interesting and completely unique. But I think as the 40k universe gets more saturated, it becomes very hard to achieve these kind of breakthrough moments, these kind of core memory kind of moments in the fan base, because frankly at this stage we might have just about seen it all, which is unfortunate. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of things that Games Workshop could do if they really wanted to. I mean, I'm of the opinion that Games Workshop can sell us anything at this point, right? Like, the fan base will get behind just about anything you release, anything that company releases, regardless of how compelling or not compelling as the case may be. But yeah, Necrons were a key moment in time for me and my hobby, and it was great. Really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed the spectacle of it. Really enjoyed getting my I believe it was my Chaos Marines blown up. Really enjoyed watching Imperial Guard get mowed down by Necron flayed ones. Not flayed ones, sorry, Gauss Flayers. And watching Imperial Guard tanks get blown up. I believe it was Ian Pixter who played against the Necrons in their inaugural battle report. I believe, I might be wrong, but yeah. That was good fun watching the Imperial Guard realize how far in over their heads they were, and how exciting it was to see the new boys take on essentially the straight men of the previous edition. The poor humans, always the first to encounter this kind of nonsense, and unfortunately rarely live to tell the tale. I believe in the lore it was a sisters' convent that was the first to kind of have a picked grab sort of recording of Necron assault in progress. And it was just sort of blurry kind of picked capture as described in the storyline. It's a kind of horror trope, that really sort of made it familiar and exciting for us. And we really love that kind of storytelling. Cool. So I am just coming in to put a little bit more color into the Aeldari Emerald as a highlight. Aeldari Emerald really sits well on the surface as a. I believe this is a pure color, right? Like it's a pure pigment. It's not mixed with anything else. Therefore, it sits on the surface really beautifully. This kind of malachite green color. And I missed the whole spot below, which I will fill up in black because you know what? It doesn't matter. No one's gonna see this part, and just like I said earlier, no one's gonna care if I don't paint every single wire and cable in something other than black. There we go. That's a good way to end off the miniature. Just want to clean up a little bit of silver around this Egyptian motif. And a bit of black to close off this section. And I think that's good. Right? I mean, it's nice and simple. Nothing too complex. But that makes him a handsome lad in my eyes. There we go. All good. Okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed watching this. I don't know whether there are any other bits that I might come in to fix later on. But as I say that, I guess a little bit more emphasis on the green might be nice. It's the top highlights. These really are narrow little ridges, so you gotta be extremely careful to not spill over. And a little bit more maybe on the tip of the gun, just to really bring your eye to that point. But for the most part, I think this guy is good enough to go. Maybe a pointer on the eyes as well. Boop, boop, boop. And that's good. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed watching me reminisce about Necron Raiders as well as talk about color scheme selection. Have a good one. Cheers. Love you all. Like, comment and subscribe if you can. If you enjoyed watching this foray and this mindless rambling, let me know in the comments below. Cheers. Have a great one. Pew pew!